Yeah, and I didn't know. Yes, we want to introduce. Up next, for those of you watching, we're going to have the consultants that the fair hired to provide recommendations on how the fair could be more welcoming and inclusive to BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, as well as LGBTQIA people, and that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, queer, and others. Basically folks from marginalized communities that the fair has not felt particularly welcoming to in the past. And by not felt welcoming to, that's by the accounts of people who identify in those ways. So it's not by the fair's account necessarily. Do we want to spend a little bit talking about that and the diversity committee before and just kind of set it up? Do you feel good about that?
Yeah, that's fine. Let's do it.
Okay. So Brittanya and I are both on the diversity committee. You might have seen us in the panel earlier today talking about some of these issues. And we've done the fair has done a lot of deep and really, as Brittanya was referring to, kind of rapid work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in this past year, passing board motions and getting consultants and really wanting to tackle this head on. And we've talked a little bit earlier today about the pitfalls about that. So do you want to talk about how we kind of got to consultants and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I know it's been a long effort by members of the diversity committee who were there before I was there. And starting with some education, some learning opportunities. And it came to a point where the diversity committee was getting a lot stronger. There was a wider cultural shift towards this racial reckoning, and we came up with several motions that the board passed some of them. And the one we started with was having a team of consultants take a look at the fair and guide us on where to start. And so our 4 consultants, Mark Harris, Johnny Lake, Siobhan Cancél, and Oblio Stroyman, did such amazing work in giving us some recommendations, leading some learning opportunities for the diversity committee and fair leadership. And their work continues. I really hope to continue working with the consultants. The work has really just started, but having this map has been so essential.
Yeah, and there was, quite a bit of, a lot of the fair family and throughout the fair really wanted access to the consultants, really wanted to work with the consultants, really wanted training from the consultants. And that was like really awesome to hear. And we were really hoping that this is, folks can kind of see this as a little first step, this is not the end all be all. This is not the only access that can be provided, but funds are tight because there's no event. I mean, this whole event is a fundraiser. I guess it would be, we as hosts should ask you to donate to this event. There's a donate button down below us. And that's is a reason, yes. Some might say, me included, that, we could prioritize this work a little higher in our budgeting process and in the way we're thinking about budgets and spending money. But there just was not the funding to pay, for whatever reason. The board did not allocate the funding to pay for highly skilled, internationally respected consultants to spend time with every area of our large, kind of amorphous Byzantine organization. That would, that's like, if you were a corporation, we are a nonprofit corporation, a corporation of our size paying for this work, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and not the 15, it was 20, we're arguing about whether it's 15 or 20. That's not enough to talk to all of the crafters, to talk to all of the vendors, to talk to all of the stagehands and the people who control the stages and the crew leaders and the board and the diversity committee and the path planning committee and the land use management planning committee. I mean, it's just not 20 grand is a drop in the bucket for the level of work we need to do in a place that has the word Oregon, you know, white supremacy in a state, in a nutshell, country, not particularly known for being welcoming to Black or queer people or Indigenous people, and then fair, okay, carnies, we got that. But like, you know, it's not a, it's a drop in the bucket. And so we hope, our sincere hope is that the fair invest in this heavily in the future, that we, you know, do whatever is necessary to prioritize this work in a budgetary sense, and that we really commit outside of just our rhetoric, in our actual actions and our budgets and our, you know, ways that we're being at this fair. And I think yeah, go ahead, Britannia.
That question that Aaron just asked of what are we willing to do to ease BIPOC pain, and that of course goes for LGBTQIA plus as well. Like, what are we willing to do for these communities that we're already doing for the dominant culture within OCF? And yeah, really investing in our consultants and their recommendations is such a big part of that. But yeah, it looks like most of our panel.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring in, maybe we can bring in people as we introduce them, if that sounds good to you, Britannia.
Yeah, we're still missing one person, but I could just start with the introduction.
Yeah, let's start with, I'm going to bring you in, Iana. Let's start with Iana. Iana's lovely. She is on the diversity committee with Britannia and I, and she will be moderating today's panel. And before we, let me go ahead and introduce you, and then I'll see if you have any thoughts if we missed anything about our kind of setup of this. But Iana is a performance artist, activist, mother, and farmer from Eugene. She has been attending the country fair since she was in her mother's womb. And she has worked with social justice groups and nonprofits for most of her life, including the Committee for Countering Military Recruitment, Growers Market Food Cooperative, and Youth in Action. She was co-manager of the Wayne Morris Youth Program and worked with Lane County as the coordinator of the Positive Youth Development Initiative. She's been trained as a facilitator with the Power of Hope and utilizes their philosophy of youth empowerment through cultural appreciation, participation, and acceptance. She founded Inspire through the spoken word program at OCF with her partner Ishi, and for 15 years has been one of the only outlets for hip hop and multicultural youth empowerment during the event. She's been part of the OCS Diversity Committee over the past year, and we are thrilled that she agreed to moderate this panel for us. Welcome, Iana. Anything to add in our setup there?
Well, I think that maybe this could be a great time to go over just a little brief overview of some of the recommendations that the consultants did offer, since we are still potentially waiting for Asante to join us.
Great.
And yeah, so thank you for that introduction. And I'm super grateful to be here to be able to moderate. If any participants want to put anything in, the chat, either on the fair site or here on Zoom, if you're here on Zoom, please do so. This is really an opportunity to kind of get to know some of these amazing people that have dedicated plenty of hours, I'm sure somewhat over their contract, to try to help this event, because the fair is a beautiful, amazing event in a lot of ways. And there are so many ways that we can, be better. And this was one of the initial steps to that. So Brooks and Britannia just told us a little bit about how the consultants came to be. And we basically had a very short contract period and limited hours, like they said, and they were able to put together a very comprehensive, in my opinion, beautiful, basically document of the recommendations that they see could help us as an organization to basically walk our walk when it comes to diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion. So just to go over a few things, like I said, the recommendations that they did lay out was very comprehensive, especially given the time they had. But just to kind of go over a few of what that means, the things that the country fair could do in order to truly create change and create empowerment for marginalized communities. The number one, which the diversity committee was very appreciative that this was number one, is to create a dedicated staff position. Ideally, multiple people, could be 2, 3, but even if it was just one, somebody who has a demonstrated background in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and who are members of marginalized communities themselves. There's many things that this position could do, but essentially, if you think about it, if you're a FAIR family, you think of it as like a bum or a coordinator, acts as kind of a liaison to the broader, FAIR community, as well as the staff. This staff position, if they were dedicated to DEI, would be able to help tackle a lot of these issues and help facilitate the volunteer base in tackling some of these issues of inclusion that we have experienced. Another thing is basically to create more ongoing learning opportunities. The task force and the diversity committee has done some throughout the years that they've been involved. But as Brooks was saying, finding funding for this in this organization has been very difficult. So if we have a commitment to ongoing and effective learning opportunities that are related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and that address the structural and institutional isms, then this is a huge thing that the broader community of the FAIR can start to tackle, rather than just expecting 1 or 2 staff persons to kind of do everything. That would basically promote burnout and wouldn't necessarily create that lasting change that we're looking at. So multiple, basically people, outside trainers, all sorts of different levels of participants that could create lasting change in all the levels of FAIR, because we have a complex organization, let's be real, right? Another couple things would be our hiring committees at this point aren't, there's nothing written that says it has to be composed of marginalized people and people that are outside of the board of directors. It's been a board responsibility thus far, which is great because we love the board, yes, and we need lots of different input in order to find hiring solutions that will fit with our social justice and diversity, equity, inclusion type of work. There's also some ideas of creating a team. This is one thing that came a little bit out of some of the ideas the diversity committee put forward in a couple motions last fall, but the consultants outlined it very well again. To assemble a team that could be people of diversity committee members, could be others, that will support the dedicated DEI staff person. So these folks would be trained by professionals with demonstrated expertise in consent, survivor trauma, and intersectionality, so that there isn't just 1 or 2 people ever working on these things, but there's always multiple. And a team to basically back each other up, accountability. There's so many reasons why we want more people involved in this. So having a team that is potentially separate from that team that could also help us create more dedicated spaces is another one of the recommendations. Whether it's a booth, whether it's a whole wing of FAIR, we could go many levels to it. But we need somebody who's passionate to do this and that ensures diverse representation, because that's essential, so that a BIPOC person can talk to a BIPOC person, or an LGBTQIA person could talk to another, queer person, whatever those traumas are. As we know, if a sexually assaulted person knows that there's an advocate or someone who is a survivor, you're going to have a different level of understanding and safe space created with that. So there's multiple more, and we are going to be actually putting this out to the FAIR community, and we're going to continually work on this. All these recommendations, there's so much to unpack with this organization, but it's an incredibly beautiful start to how we can really create lasting change in our organization. So this is some of the work they've been doing. These consultants met with multiple levels of the FAIR staff, as well as the board and the leadership positions. And like Brooks did say, the funding that we had was not something that would allow them to talk to every level of FAIR. So this was the first initial baby steps. We gave them a massive thing to tackle, and they did an incredible job with limited resource to basically begin tackling it. And so we're super proud of them. We're really grateful they're able to come in and be a part of this panel here. And hopefully there are some people that want to ask questions and participate. And if not, we're grateful to just have this here and recorded so that people can come back to this in the future and really understand some of this work that's being done. It can be a situation where people will complain, more than they will participate when with work like this, because it's hard work and nobody wants to be racist or homophobic. And yet sometimes our actions are that. I, as a queer, BIPOC woman, that doesn't mean I'm exempt from being, ableist or homophobic, saying something that would offend somebody at times, even if that wasn't my intent. So that's going to only be more so true from somebody who may not be from such marginalized communities. So it's a really huge thing to be able to really respect and understand what everybody has to offer. And these professionals have been putting in a lot of time to help our fair be what it can be. So that's a little overview of what the recommendations kind of look like. There will be more, like I said, if anybody's interested in this, or even if you're watching this later, by that point, it'll definitely be posted and you'll be able to go through the full recommendations and hopefully get involved to be a part of, creating and coordinating some of these things that are recommended. So we don't have our last participant yet, but I think we should go ahead and start with introductions, correct? And I was hoping that, he might come in during that spiel, but that's all right, we'll get there. It is fair time, even though we're in the clouds.
Right, we're still at the fair. This is it. Happy fair, main stage behind me.
Yay.
Yeah, well, I'll start with Siobhan then. Siobhan Cancél is the founder of Siobhan Solutions here in Eugene. She has constructed the listening sessions and education programs. With Siobhan Solutions by working with many organizations and individuals. She's passionate about helping others and is an advocate for change. She believes that equitable organizations will have a positive impact on the surrounding community and increase economic growth. Siobhan welcomes the opportunity to help organizations. She has over 20 years of experience in corporate structure and organizational management. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in business and in chemistry. And she believes, quote, if we can have the uncomfortable conversations, that we can start to tackle the real issues and make change happen, end quote. Do you want to go next, Britannia? Or shall I keep rolling?
I can do.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I can take the next one. Thanks. All right. Oblio Stroyman, who uses they, them pronouns, is a former family therapist turned social justice activist when they decided to follow their heart. Oblio holds a BS in psychology and women and gender studies and an M.Ed in couples and family therapy. Oblio is the interim executive director, grant and training director of the nonprofit Transponder, a support, resource hub, and training organization based in Eugene, Oregon, on issues of gender diversity. They give presentations all over the country on topics of gender, sexuality, sexual health, intersectionality, LGBTQIA+ communities, addiction, power and privilege, consent, couples therapy, alternative relationship models, and healthy communication. Oblio consults with numerous organizations to assess their environment regarding unconscious bias and unconscious inclusion in policies and procedures, materials, infrastructure, and physical space. Oblio is the founder of Gender Camp, a week-long camp for intra and interpersonal growth and community building, and is on the organizing committee of the International Gender Odyssey Conference. They founded the Rainbow Village at Oregon Country Fair, a LGBTQIA dedicated space and resource booth. The Rainbow Connection, also at OCF, an LGBTQIA+ affinity space, co-created the Queer Sanctuary at Beloved Festival, and works in tandem allyship for the BIPOC sanctuaries at both festivals. Oblio teaches regularly for Lost Valley Educational Center and the University of Oregon on topics of identity, community building, and communication. And I just heard from Dr. Lake, and he'll be in 5 minutes.
Great. Well, Mark Harris here, let me bring you in, Mark, as I introduce you. Mark is a retired college professor teaching and practicing mental health, cultural recovery as an independent counselor and consultant. He has taught addiction studies, ethnic studies, coping skills for stress and depression, and cultural competency. He first practiced in the Oregon Country Fair in 1978 as a musician, then as a crisis worker for Whitebird in 84 and 85, then as a stagehand and a performer, and lastly, as a spoken word artist. His 47-year career spans experience at the federal, state, and local levels on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mahalo.
Welcome.
And I will introduce Johnny Lake in his Dr. Johnny Lake as we await his arrival. Dr. Johnny Lake is a Black man from Tennessee who was raised in a strong, vibrant Black family and community that traces back to 1798 and 1741 in the same place. He was related to everybody. He experienced strict racial segregation until 5th grade, and then integrated into all white schools where he was the only Black student in class. That began his career in cross-country and with white classroom bully on first day. Dr. Lake is an educator, writer, speaker, and storyteller. He came to the Fair family in 2006 to tell stories despite urgent warnings from the scared university community. He has been a regular member of Fair family since and continues to support the community. He has served as a professor, administrator, child therapist, counselor, college advisor / mentor with mental health agencies, hospitals, schools, and communities. He consults with court systems, police, schools and universities, mental health, business, communities and churches on issues of race, culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. He has worked in the US, Canada, France, and Turkey. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate with a history degree and possesses a PhD in educational leadership. He currently teaches at Pacific University. He was chair of the Oregon Commission on Black Affairs. He received awards for work with children and families. He is a father and single parent who successfully raised 4 children. He is still a Southerner and appreciates your kindness and hospitality.
All right, we'll pop him in when he arrives, and otherwise, take it away, Iana.
Great. So welcome everyone, and future welcome to Johnny. We have a few questions that are prepared by us. And again, if you are a participant and you have a question that you want to go ahead and throw in the chat, feel free to do so. We do have people monitoring the chats on both the Zoom as well as the Country Fair website. I think the streaming issues have been mostly taken care of at this point. I know there were some issues from the site earlier today, but you know, we're technologically moving along. So the first question that I believe is pretty massive, but we're gonna go ahead and just pose the questions. And if anybody feels inspired, you can go ahead and just, you know, unmute yourself. There's only a few of you, so that should work out fine. And if not, I'll go ahead and call on people. But our first question is, as you see it, what are the top challenges that the fair is facing regarding DEI? So what are some of the top challenges that you guys see? And of course, with your experience the past few months, you have a lot of different levels of insight with those challenges that we may be facing when it comes to DEI.
If one were to be, you can hear me? Yes?
We can.
If one were to be blunt, which as an addictions worker, I find it useful to get straight to the point and be blunt, talk about uncomfortable subjects uncomfortably. If you look at the organizational the DNA of FAIR, which basically started as a rebel splinter group away from the pretty much mostly white Renaissance Fair out of California, and then a group of crafters break away from that, but don't necessarily examine the portrayal of the Renaissance, which was actually historically multiracial, coming out of the Dark Ages, and it was people of color that helped Europe come out of the Dark Ages. But if you look at their website, it doesn't portray that. And if you look at the Oregon Country Fair's portrayal with people of color, it's not necessarily a broad section of representing those particular communities, only the folks that, are rainbow or feathers and all those other kinds of things, not necessarily other folks. So when you have essentially what appears on the surface to be kind of like a white hippie crafts fair, how does diversity play out in that organization? When in part of the introduction before we got into this, when Brooks was talking about all the different sections like staging and security and crafts and the path and et cetera, et cetera. And I've had experience in all of those things. Diversity issues definitely play out in staging, like how you run the stage and how you introduce people, and is your crew diverse, and is your MC diverse, or do you have the same people? So kind of becomes the fair is sort of like the in crowd. And if you're in the in crowd, or if you know somebody that's in the in crowd, which I have, right? So, and I can be critical of, yeah, what does diversity mean? Does that mean you need to expand the in crowd, or what does that mean? So our recommendations were kind of like, yeah, let's start with, kind of like the standard things and expand what those are. I think we got up to what, 20 recommendations? Yeah, and it's tricky, right? Because, we started in a standard format of this is what organizations like the fair do. So we're not off the wall and recommending the things that we did. That's like standard practice. But it means that it's going to be a hard implement, really. So I commend you for doing the work and wanting to start the difficult process, and we're here for you.
Thank you. And I just want to take a second to welcome Johnny. Dr. Johnny Lake just showed up. We did introduce you already, so yes, you missed your own introduction. That's okay.
Traffic is crazy.
I believe it. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah.
So we were just on the first question, which was, as you see it, what are the top challenges FAIR is facing regarding DEI? And Mark covered it very well. I don't know if anybody else would like to speak on that one as well, just about the challenges the FAIR is facing. Julio?
I have something to say. As kind of one of those outsiders of FAIR, like Mark was talking about, it's like I do know, especially after participating in this lovely journey, a lot more people in FAIR, but that was not the case 6 months ago. And so when I think of one of the issues, it's access. It's like, how do I, as just a regular person, get into FAIR, stay the night at FAIR, feel comfortable at FAIR, and where do I find my safe space at FAIR? So that's something that I think with the recommendations, we talked a lot about, like how we could be more inclusive. And so I think that kind of expands on what Mark was saying about, making the in crowd bigger or doing away with the in crowd altogether.
Institutions practice what I call institutional self-defense. Status quo is comfortable for most organizations, otherwise they would not be in existence. They've discovered how to continue to survive through changes. There's one historian who says every step of progress in America has been 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. So anytime you push against structural kind of issues, you will get pushback. And I think that's what Mark was referring to with some of his comments earlier. And so the whole issue of FAIR is trying to maintain equilibrium, which equilibrium was not equity. And so as you continue to push on this equilibrium, you're probably going to get more pushback. So I would say the bigger issue is, how is the FAIR going to do something that our society is not willing or able to do? And that's challenge racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, all in the context of a small group of human beings who are very much invested in the larger society in which we live. So if white people can't be white, who they're gonna be at the fair? And I ask that to white people in the room and you get silence because they don't have anywhere else to go other than to be white. So what's that status for a white person in a place? I do it with my classes. I say, how many of you teachers are gonna have a classroom where you will have no racism operating in your classroom? And all of them say yes. I said, so if there's no racism operating in your classroom, then what's gonna happen to the white children in your classroom? Because you know who they're thinking about when I say racism. They're thinking about the kids of color. And it catches them by surprise. I says, no, I want you to think about what's gonna happen to white children in your classroom if racism does not operate in your classroom. Because outside in the hallway, are children of color gonna experience racism? Yes, on the playground, in the cafeteria, at the gym, in the bus, down the hall, at Fred Meyer's, in their neighborhood. They're gonna experience racism everywhere except where? In your classroom. And I said, for white children, if you really do have a space where racism does not operate, white people will not experience white privilege. And I said, guess who they're gonna blame? If those white children who come to your class, because outside in the hall, they get white privilege. In the cafeteria, they get white privilege. In the gym, they get white privilege. Everywhere else, they get white privilege, except where? In your classroom. And so if we take that as an analogy for FAIR, what are white people gonna feel if we actually create a space that is, there's no racism? Are they gonna feel affirmed? Are they gonna feel welcome? Are they gonna feel even a part of a group like that that does not recognize whiteness as any kind of advantage? And so structural institutional work, I would say, is the biggest. Give me one or two people who are acting up and we all know what to do in those cases. But when you got a structure that's practicing what I call self-defense, you have a tough road to go to make that institution do anything different other than what it has done historically.
I want to support everything that my colleagues just said. Like, so yes, super well said. And on the more personal level, on the individuals at FAIR, I think that one of the biggest obstacles is folks understanding the idea of impact versus intent. And I think people at FAIR are very committed to not being the bad guy. That it's an us versus them, and that we're all in this together against racism, against transphobia, against homophobia. We're all in this together. So anytime you say something that steps on somebody's toes and somebody lets you know, then we can get in the game together. It's not an attack on you personally. It's a gift. It's an invitation to do something different and join as a team. But what I see a lot happening at FAIR are people are very concerned that they're not being seen, that their intent isn't being understood when their impact on somebody who's marginalized is really painful. And then they shut off their ears and then they aren't listening anymore because they're so concerned with being attacked. And I see a lot of folks at FAIR in the dominant culture in whatever way they are say, well, I haven't had that experience. So what are you talking about? Everybody here is really, really kind. Isn't all of FAIR gay? Like, you know, isn't it safe for everybody? I mean, my experience, I can wear a skirt. I feel great. I have a beard and a skirt. I'm accepted. What do you mean? And rather than being like, wow, friend, tell me what your experience is and let me know how I can be part of the team to make it so that you can feel as free here as I do. And so impact versus intent, and people joining the team when they're told by marginalized voices that there's a different experience happening at FAIR rather than invalidating it.
That is a huge piece. And I think that's really big for all across the board people. We often kind of point the finger at white people saying, you're not going to understand the same, maybe because you're coming from a place of privilege. But I have had the same experience with people of color that didn't know that there was, you know, some violent racist act that happened or some level of disrespect. Oh, it's just FAIR. It's all family here. But so that doesn't just go for, you know, white-bodied folks or, you know, cisgendered or straight folks. That is true within marginalized communities as well. It's, if you haven't experienced it directly in that space, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? That's a very excellent point.
I made a point today. I said, if a fish is in the water, does he get wet?
Right.
They didn't even know where I was going with that. But if you are in a racist society, you think you missed it? I don't care what color you are. You have learned the same stuff that everybody else in that water have learned. So you got to get good and unlearn it and undo it.
Precisely. So yeah, part of Well, the big questions here, especially with the recommendations coming out and the kind of closure of y'all's contract with the fair thus far, leads us right to that next question, which is, how do we implement what we learned from your work at OCF and create change? And of course, this is huge, so you can take whatever piece you want. But what does that change look like for leadership, staff, volunteers, management, and the public? So how are we implementing what you've learned from your work, and how does that look for all those different levels of FAIR participants?
You know, somebody asked me about the work that we did at FAIR, and, you know, I can't put on my rose-colored glasses and say I expect all the change to happen. And I said, I think the best thing, if nothing else, that's come out of this work is hopefully folks in leadership have learned a bit more about how to listen. And so, you know, we'll be talking about this tomorrow, but there's going to be a BIPOC sanctuary and an LGBTQIA plus sanctuary there, where folks can gather in affinity spaces and have real conversations about the changes that they want to see happen at FAIR, that we want to see happen at FAIR. And if we've done nothing else, hopefully the leadership is in a better place to listen. The concepts that we've introduced won't be all of a sudden brand new news, and maybe through doing some process around it, leadership won't be so triggered when they hear it come up. And so when folks from these sanctuaries are coming up with ideas and take it to the leadership, there can be a communication of respect and action plan co-created.
I would say one of the critical issues is to hire and retain competence when whatever form that competence shows up in. So certainly working for Lane Community College and not being an affirmative action hire, and I mean that in the strict legal sense, where they were breaking the law was standard practice, so they weren't even implementing the legal definition of affirmative action. And one of the things they said is, you're overqualified. Well, wait, that's illegal to say that, but I just need to be able to be competent to do the job. And since I replaced somebody that clearly relapsed in place, you obviously hired a white boy that was incompetent to even do the job that you had. Now, so for example, with staging. So I've worked and respect David Paul. We've worked on crews before, Grateful Dead shows, and I've risen to leadership of certain crews to construct the sound towers and things like that. And I've run stage. But I've never, other than Shady Grove, run stage at the country fair, even though I have the skill set to run main stage. And David Paul knows that. But, you know, I'm not necessarily looking for his job, but would I be considered to run stage at main stage? And would I want to do that too? That's another issue, but you know, I do have the skill. Now, one of the things that I had to ask as a stage manager of Shady Grove is, why is this an acoustic stage? Why doesn't this have a sound system that's permanently wired and on the electrical grid? And who's controlling the money? Because when I'm asking and when I'm told by my crew chief that more money was spent on main camp's alcohol budget than the Karamatsovs and the budget. So when I raised that issue as a consultant and was told, well, we don't pay for alcohol, that was 25 years ago. Well, look, if you're hiring competent people of color or competent diverse people, or just competent people, they aren't going to ask questions about money. Because budgets reflect priorities. And if your priorities aren't industry standard and producing certain outcomes in your return on investment, you should expect people to ask those kind of questions. And if those questions are uncomfortable for you, especially if it's being asked by a competent person of color, like what is threatening? That a person of color is questioning your budget, or that anybody's questioning your budget? Because your game should be tight, no matter what. And so that's part of the mix of, yeah, you've been an in crowd, and now people are asking difficult questions that you should actually have the answer to comfortably.
I'd like to jump in off of Mark. Oh, sorry, Dr. Lake.
No, go ahead.
Just something that Mark said that made my ears perk up is money. So how would we like to see our recommendations be implemented would be to put money behind it. You pay for things you desire. You show that desire maybe by purchasing something that's a little more fancier than you need. But in this case, this is work that is very much necessary. So I would like to see that sort of change, is actual money put towards this work to show that commitment. And then secondly, I think one of the things that, or at least I hope one of the things that us third-party consultants, somewhat third-party consultants, were able to provide is a support system to all the people who have already been doing this work, and give another voice to these people that have really just been screaming into the wind for sometimes years and decades. So I think, kind of getting back to what Oblio said about leadership, is like, I hope that they're listening, and I hope that, they can make some changes by showing up and putting money behind it to actually back it up.
I'll second what Oblio said about listening, and it goes both ways. Listening is a two-way street. And if it doesn't happen, you can bet that you will not make progress. And on top of that, I would say, what is a safe space at FAIR for people? Are we able to create that? If I come into FAIR, whatever my identity is, and I don't feel safe, then I'm really not going to be able to participate. And so for leadership, I would say implementing the recommendations. We tried to keep the recommendations on the ground, things that can actually be done, rather than these aspirations about, oh, we're going to create a safe environment. No, well, no, you're not, because you don't have a safe environment yet. And so for leadership, I would say, think about what it means to be a leader in creating a safe space for everybody, because there's no prescription for that stuff. And we sure can't tell you how to be a leader creating a safe space. Each one of you are different, and you got different assets and different skills, different resources, different abilities, and you need to access those things in order to actually impact what happens at FAIR from the leadership position. But again, I'll emphasize it third time, listening to each other. If you create that space where we actually get the chance to listen, because there's going to be differences, I guarantee you, there's going to be differences among leadership. But that two-way street where we actually really do listen to each other is the way I think we start building that sense of community and that sense of safety, that sense of belonging, and especially when we have disagreements. When we have disagreements and I'm done with you, it's like, where do we go from there? I mean, I don't want to hear from Mark anymore. I'm tired of listening to Mark. He talks too much. Where can Mark and I go from there? And so even if we disagree, which Mark and I disagree a lot of times on things, but we stay engaged in that conversation and we come to a better understanding. I think both of us learn from those differences of perspective and opinion. And this is what I want FAIR to think about, is those differences of perspectives and opinion is the real meaning of diversity. People talk about diversity. Oh, we got some Black people, we got some Latinos, we got some Native Americans, got some gay, lesbian people, we got some disabled. That's what people do. But the real question of diversity is, how is this stuff working together with us inside, again, that institution, organization we're trying to create that's going to be very different. And I believe FAIR is already different. So I think we are giving you critiques, but I would say I have felt more welcome at FAIR than I have in Eugene, where I bought a house, where I got a job, where I live every day, where I go to the store every day. I felt more welcome and safe and at home at FAIR than I have in this community that I call home. I don't even hate to even say that, because it ain't home. But think about that, and the assets that FAIR has, I think you have a lot of things to build on.
Absolutely, expanding on those safe spaces. And I know the first time I saw you at Fair, Johnny, was with the spoken word camp. And I know that that camp particularly, I feel anyway, does an excellent job in making folks feel welcome. And
Yes.
that is a subset of the culture that we should be enunciating and showing that it is happening.
Great example. Great example.
So for those of you that did just join, if you want just a quick little update of what's going on, these are our wonderful consultants that we hired as the country fair over the past about 6 months or so. They've created an immense work of implementing some, not implementing, but creating some recommendations that we may be able to implement as an organization. There's about 19 of them, and that will be posted to the broader community later on. But if any of you feel like you'd like to ask a question, this is an open house. We prepared questions, but if anyone of the community has an input, go ahead and put it in the chat, either here or on the on the OCF page, whether you're on Zoom or on OCF, because we do want this to be an opportunity for you all to ask questions if you have any. And if not, we'll just go ahead and go down our list as well. And so this next one builds a bit off of, oh, thank you, Oblio, for that. That's really huge. If people want to turn on their camera, and I really appreciate that. They told us that in one of the workshops we did. Oblio continues to mention, turn on your camera, because we can kind of see who we all are. We're all coming together on the same page, and we definitely welcome that if you would like to be viewed. And likewise, if you don't want to be viewed, but you just want to put yourself in the chat, whatever way to hear your voice. That's the point, is this listening. Thank you, guys. The listening and the sharing, like we're talking about, is how we're creating this change, truly. And that's beautiful. So yay, thanks for everybody who's showing up. It's nice to see extra faces. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. The last one was, how are we going to implement the work that they kind of, the changes and the recommendations they gave? And this next one goes along with that, in that, how might we measure the success when implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion principles at Country Fair, which is it's a tricky one to be able to measure success. There's many ways to do that. We're not going to wake up and say, yay, equality is here necessarily. But is there any ways that you as consultants might be able to recommend to us, that things that we can look for that may be a measure of success when we implement this work, assuming that we do all the recommendations perfectly, right? Hopefully.
I would say that start small. I mean, one of our recommendations was to have multi-language signage. I mean, that could be done immediately. And then look, you can celebrate that, one checked off. And then just keep following up. I mean, even if you don't succeed in accomplishing one of the goals, as long as you've made progress toward it, talking about the progress that's been toward it, maybe even talking about how the goal has changed, as long as it's constantly in front of you, I think that progression will happen naturally. I do think it gets kind of hard sometimes, especially in this work, because you're right. We're not going to wake up and say, yay, we're all equal and it's a safe space for everybody. But we could make some small steps, and I think those need to be celebrated. We so often kind of just sweep those to the side for the next thing, but for each step that you take forward, it's a celebration.
Well, Liana, you had said, assuming we have all the recommendations made. So let's say we've done that, but one of measures of success is that the people who are the most marginalized at Fair are saying that they feel safer, are saying that it feels like there's a space. It's the self-report. It's not just checking the boxes. And even if all of the recommendations were met and people still weren't feeling safe, then that wouldn't be success. Success is these spaces. And for me, sometimes success at Fair has looked like having a conversation over at the Rainbow Village, people coming in and asking questions, youth coming in and asking questions. And then the next day at Fair, I hear people having these discussions about safety or pronouns or cultural appropriation, or just having these discussions, so that this is in the awareness of people. And I see that spreading. To me, that's a measure of success too, that we're actually all having the conversations, not just specialty pods or specialty spaces.
There are metrics to success, and they're pretty square, really, in any organization. One organization, I said, is this a white organization? And nobody said a word. Everybody froze. I said, y'all just answered my question and you didn't even say a word. And then I asked him, how many people of color do you have in leadership? Everybody froze again. I said, you just answered my question and you didn't even say anything, because they had no people of color in leadership either. And so there are some square metrics that you want to use. How representative is your leadership of the community that Country Fair serves? And that's not just race, but that's a way to get into that conversation, is how diverse are the leaders and the decision makers and the money people, the people who are deciding what's done and fair. How diverse is that group? And you want to work toward that. And this is definitely incremental, as Siobhan said. And I think maybe it's an American trait. We want to lay out a plan and we're supposed to have it done by when? Tomorrow. Supposed to have had it done. And when we come back, I'm gonna make sure you did it. And so you're not gonna go from not so good at DEI to great at DEI. It's not gonna be a sea change. It's gonna be little by little, incremental change. And you have to, as Siobhan said, you have to recognize those things and grab onto them and celebrate those things and use those things as the jump off for continued effort and work to make progress. We are hard on each other. You guys know that. One organization I work with, and I found out it's true. This one woman said, you can do 999 things right, and you do one thing wrong, and your job is at risk. How many people familiar with that attitude about the way people are expected to do things? 999 things you got right, and you did one thing wrong, and what did they focus on? That one thing. Now, how many times you gonna keep doing that? You ain't gonna keep doing that long. And so we have to catch those moments when we can celebrate with each other. Even if there's a negative situation that happened. This is one of the things I try to get organizations to understand, that is actually an opportunity. You never run from something happened that was unexpected, or, you know, we didn't think this was gonna happen, it happened. Step into that. You take away the power from it when you step into those situations and say, okay, this was wrong. This is what we're going to do. And that proves to people that we are here for the work and not just for the appearance or the optics. And so I would think about ways to create measures. I mean, simple surveys are so powerful. I've done a 5-question survey that's just absolutely amazing at what it means to people to get that kind of assessment in the middle of whatever work they're doing. And it can be so simple as to, we can create one right here. I'm sure the rest of the consultants probably can come up with a single question that would be something people would want to know. I feel like we're making progress with DEI. How complicated is that? You get a number back. If it's over 50%, guess what you do? The majority of our people believe that we're making progress. Now, they may be lying, but you got a statistic now that you can put in a chart and say, okay, at least half the people here believe that we're making progress. If you are a person of color, do you believe the fair is committed to DEI work? Or if you're an underrepresented person, but I mean, you see how easy it is? And so those things should become normalized rather than exceptionalized. I think we've exceptionalized surveys so that we think a survey is gonna tell you what God said. Survey is gonna tell you, I call it a snapshot survey. That's why I label my surveys, snapshot survey, based on the way those old cameras used to work. You remember the old Polaroids when you pull it out and you have to shake it before you see what the picture looked like? If that picture was really ugly, what'd you do with it? You tore it in little bitty bits and threw it away and got yourself together and took another picture. Think about the surveys for Oregon Country Fair as that kind of process where you are taking them just a moment in time, and it's not a full assessment of your organization. It's just a moment in time. If it's good, you celebrate it. If it's not good, you go back and you do some work, you survey again. So surveys should become pretty normal for Country Fair, and they shouldn't be complicated or hard for people to understand. They should be very simple, straightforward.
They also should be very accessible. So you shouldn't have to track somebody down to find the survey. I mean, they should be on QR codes on your ticket to get in or on your wristband, or, make it super accessible to all the people that it just comes with everybody's entry.
I think part one measure of success. Heard a definition of success where success is doing what you said you were going to do with grace and ease. Now, some of that is metrics, things you can measure numerically, but a lot of that is feel. Can you hire and retain people who are more skilled than your average person and feel good about them being in their positions and being excellent while other people might have been mediocre? Can you retain excellence with grace and ease without being threatened? And part of here's what that excellence looks like, I mean, in jazz terms, right? So you have to have competence musically, but you make mistakes. Can you make the mistakes into art? Right? If I can confess, I don't look for safety at fair. I'm walking into danger anywhere that I'm in Oregon. I'm in Hawaii at the moment. So I feel safer here than Oregon. And not just because there's more people of color. Right? So there is that spirit of aloha, right? I don't look for safety in Oregon. Okay? I'm well defended. People don't mess with me. But also because if there's a microaggression, I know how to micro resist and respond to it with humor and strength, which also can be intimidating to people, but at least they respect me. In a previous conversation, we talked about how would you know if the big boys, which is a intervention wing of security, are proud boys? And what would you do if they were proud boys? Okay, so the issue then becomes, are they competent? Can they handle crisis and inebriates and people that need to be rejected with the skill of a cahoots? If you wanted to use that assent, because I came out of the Whitebird system. So, and actually my first gig, so to speak, crisis intervention, came off shift. So they called me because there was a black man who was an inebriate and sweep was happening and he wasn't going to go. So they called in the black guy to intervene with the black guy. Now, if that's a microaggression, I don't know. If that ain't a microaggression, I don't know what is, right? So I had, the conversation with him and said, and I said, they want you to move. They want you to leave, sweep is happening, et cetera, and he, faked hitting me in the face and I didn't flinch. I just looked at him. Right? So clearly, they were afraid of him being violent. I'm going, okay, you took your swing, here we are, we're in this situation. And let's look at the policy of how are you dealing with other inebriates? You ain't picking him up because you're intimidated or what? How do you handle inebriates? Because I went back and I asked, how are inebriates handled? Or do they just let them sleep it off in the woods somewhere and just let them go? Oh, you can't answer that question? Well, right? So part of that was a hiccup that happened in 1984. The person is, since joined the ancestors, but it becomes an ongoing situation in terms of these little things where if the big boys were proud boys and they would, jump on the guy and treat him roughly, and is that the message of safety you want to give as part of the Orkin Country Fair? Do you want to handle the difficult situations with grace and ease? And can you do that? Because in terms of being a jazz musician, how did it feel? How does it feel? Did you arrive there with grace and ease? That's part of the success metric, not just numbers, but also feel. And there are going to be some bumps in the road. Definitely. This is difficult work. So we're glad that you've taken that step, but it's a difficult process and there will be hiccups, and that's okay. Make it look like part of the act in terms of building your skill.
Definitely. Yeah, that feeling is an excellent measure of success. Britannia has been bringing that to our diversity committee meetings a lot recently, and that kind of emotional, connective energy of like that personal connection. And so I love the concepts of the surveys, and I love the concept of listening, and when we really can hear kind of those mic checks and those crowd checks of the FAIR community, but also the feeling that is huge. Like, how are people feeling in these interactions at FAIR? Did anyone else want to comment on that? I know, Siobhan, I saw you unmute for a second, or are you good?
Just really quickly, again, being an outsider of FAIR, when I first heard Big Boys, my bias let me hear Proud Boys. And so like, I didn't know anything about them, but that's just what I went to. And so that's also, names have meanings. And so like when you're trying to be more inclusive and increase access, even though you know what the term means, and it may be something that is you've been using for years, but to someone who's new like me, you know, it could be a little off-putting or even offensive in some cases. So just wanted to add that.
Definitely, that's huge. How do we use our language, and when is it weaponized to some degree? Because absolutely, that is such a trigger. And would it be different if it was big bitches? I don't know. Maybe it might trigger other people, right? But there's definitely other ways we can do this, right? That's huge. Good point on that.
The late Essex Hemphill once said he was, a gay activist, HIV positive activist, kind of like the James Baldwin of his generation, died of HIV in 95. And basically he said, it's not about honoring diversity, it's utilizing diversity where it's appropriate. Now, if I was having a pride rally and I knew that there was going to be a counter protest, who I'd want to have in front is not a skinny gay black man like me. I'd want the biggest black bull dykes possible in front, right? Because people are scared of them, and to utilize that fear and that display of strength. Right? So it's not about just honoring diversity, it's using diversity appropriately to achieve your objective, whatever that is.
Definitely. So if we're done on that one, how we can implement? How do we see our success when we implement it? The next one we're looking at is within FAIR, how can folks belonging to dominant cultures create meaningful relationships with those belonging to marginalized cultures? And this can become a tricky question because it's kind of like having one black friend or one gay friend or whatever, right? It's not so much that you can just say, oh no, black people love me or whatever. As we know, it's deep. All these questions are deep. The work is deep, right? But that's the next one I'll pose to you all is how can folks belonging to dominant cultures really have those meaningful relationships where they're truly allies and not just performative allies, and really connect with those in marginalized cultures? I see Oblio unmuting, or was that not an unmute?
Yeah, no, I did. I mean, because it's the thing that I said before, so I'll just reiterate it again, which is listen. Listen and validate. Listen to experiences that are different than your own. Take pause, validate, and just be present. Be with it, and ask how you can help. Right. So there's the part where you listen, and so your ears aren't shut off. There's the part where you understand that people's experiences are 100% true. Now the meaning of them, or the who, the what, the when, the why, that might be something that is a little more fuzzy, but that somebody had an experience is 100% true. So validating that experience and then asking how you can show up, because assuming how you can show up or being a missionary and taking on, like, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to do, I know what's best here. Don't do that. So that would be my like 3-chip process to being an ally in that way.
That's great. Anyone else thinking about it?
I'll use a line.
Go ahead.
I'll use a line from Chris Rock that basically this is also statistically validated. That all my white friends have one black friend. That's me. All my black friends have more than one white friend. Right? And so of different groups, you definitely want to cultivate relationships with more than one, or the one that you're comfortable with. Because, I would dare say that Siobhan, Johnny, and I both have valid black cards, but the qualifications listed on those cards are going to be different because we different. Asante basically, reference, we may disagree, but we may disagree on how to get there, but we definitely agree on the outcome, how you get there, right? So being able to cultivate multiple relationships with different communities outside of your own, getting outside of that proverbial comfort zone. As a yoga teacher, asana means comfortable seat. Now, I can't do full lotus at 66 like I could at 17, right? So there are some limitations, but I visited a clone of the Bo tree on Oahu in a meditation space run by traditional, professionally trained and traditional Hawaiian healers. So reason I brought that up is that when you are able to, again, utilize diversity and use that where it's like truly diverse and you're uncomfortable, and then you become comfortable through exposure, so you get used to it, then, to use a culinary trope, if you think black pepper is spicy, you should actually start a steady diet of Tabasco and then work your way up to habanero till you're comfortable with that, because it'll make you stronger, getting used to other people's pain and healing it.
I asked my class one time, how many of you ever been told that being white and middle class was going to be a disadvantage for you? Nobody. White people don't hear that what you are learning as a white person and as a middle class person is going to handicap you when you move into a multiracial, multicultural context, or have to deal with other people who did not come from the same place you came from. So that's one of the dilemmas for building these relationships, is that you got to do your own work first. Don't expect that person who's marginalized to do your work to help you figure out how you're going to escape whiteness and class privilege or sexuality privilege or gender privilege or anything else. That's not their job. And be grateful if anybody's willing to help you do that work. And that's where that friendship has to be developed, is around unpacking and undoing those kind of structural issues. Like, I got this white man in California who talked about his nephew, black. He said, I got a black nephew. That's how he introduced it. He said, I got a black nephew that I never knew he existed before. And he said, but we get along good and we don't ever talk about race. I'm like, this man. And he says, my sister had mental problems and she got pregnant. I'm like, I can't wait to talk to this man. I mean, his targets are this big. It's like my first question was, why did you have to introduce your nephew as black? And I said, if I had a nephew, would I need to tell you he was black or he was white or he was Native American? He didn't know how to get out of that one. And I said, you said you don't talk about race. I said, how old is he? He's 22 or 23, black man in America. I said, don't you think something's wrong if this young black man is not talking to you about race? Because I guarantee you he's being impacted just like the rest of us are, but he's not talking to you. I said, that might be a question about your relationship. And I said, your sister, she had mental problems that she ended up pregnant. I said, I never heard anybody getting pregnant from having mental problems. So you just suggested that the only way a white woman would get pregnant by a black man and have a child was what? And I mean, this man has grown tremendously in the last few weeks because he got his ass busted about everything he said, and he actually understood it. And so if you are that person who's trying to have a legitimate, meaningful, authentic relationship with another person who's marginalized or discriminated against or those kind of things, you got to show yourself. You got to show yourself. You can't walk up and say, well, you know, I'm fine and I just want to learn about your people. You know, fuck you basically is what you should get back from that kind of move. Excuse me, everybody, for cussing, but this way this society has created normal is actually what the problem is, if you can think of it that way. When I poke on whiteness, I'm not poking on white people. I'm poking on whiteness and the way it has made people blind and unable to understand what's going on around them. And yet they still remain privileged. Class does the same thing. If you think of these as social construction, you got to get yourself out of those things and be a legitimate, real person. And then I think we can have real, legitimate, meaningful interactions and relationships that let all of us work together to undo this oppressive kind of system that we all have inherited.
In that example, Asante kind of illustrated one of the issues with engaging marginalized communities. Usually the people you engage with are non-threatening to you. And so you can actually hire marginalized people that secretly have enough self-hatred within them so that they will actually publicly agree with you and marginalize the marginalized and, you know, use their position to keep other marginalized people out.
Yep.
And justify your comfort level, which should actually be uncomfortable if we're talking about a liberation context. Then
Yeah.
And the way that, you know, the man spoke about that, you know, my 22-year-old nephew doesn't talk about race with me. Yeah, a white woman having a mixed race kid must be mentally ill. Maybe he didn't mean, that wasn't his intent, but that was the effect. So a lot of people basically talk about, well, I don't know if it's my job to educate white people. Actually, it is my job, but and that is a choice that you can take to basically allow ignorance to fester and get worse, or make people aware of the unconscious things that they said and make them conscious.
Well, Mark touches on something that's really important in our community. And it's one of the things I've worked really hard since I've been here to avoid, is the conflict that is within the communities that are marginalized. Because the best way, and I dealt with it the whole time I was at U of O, the best way that people of color in our community can actually make points in the dominant white supremacist context is to push down another person of color. It proves to the system that you are on their team when you don't advocate for each other. You know, to backstab each other seems to be one of the strategies our community uses. And every time I've had any issue, they always pull up a black person or a person of color and say, well, they don't have the same problem you have. I'm like, because they kissing ass every day of the week. That's why they ain't got no problem. They ain't got nothing to do with their color. Got to do with the fact that they won't stand up, you know? But again, that's in terms of fair. those kind of strategies or moves need to be avoided, so that if Mark and I don't agree, you still want to deal with both of us. You don't want to let me push Mark down and say, you know, Mark, or Mark push me out of the conversation. And in fact, if we're in the same conversation, it'll probably be a much more honest conversation than if you talk to us separately. And Mark, I told him, I says, you need to check with your family as to why you didn't know this man existed at all until he was 22 years old. Because maybe your sister ran into the racism in your family and probably figured she could not sustain a relationship with a Black man because your family was so racist that she decided to give the child up. That might be the answer, rather than she had mental problems.
Although racism is a mental problem, right?
Yes, true.
Siobhan,
It's
did
a
you have
public health problem.
all of the above? Did you have something to add, Siobhan?
I had a couple of things now that I've heard both of the comments and stuff. So one, it made me think of, there's a phrase in one of Ice Cube's songs on Death Certificate, and it says, till this day, Black folks still can't stick together. And I don't know why that is. It's something that I find in many communities for some reason. They want to, like, in order to shine, you have to step on others. And I think that's kind of what we're dealing with this whole white supremacist system as well. It's like people feel there's not enough pie. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that. There's enough pie, or there's no pie. It's a picnic table and everybody brings a dish, and the more people that sit at the table, the greater the meal is going to be. But when it comes to interacting with marginalized folks, when it comes to interacting with marginalized folks, be intentional. I hear a lot of times about like, well, where am I supposed to find people of color? Or how do I reach out? It's like, if you're hungry, you're going to get food. If you don't find food, you're not just going to not eat. So be intentional when you're trying to interact with different communities. Like, you don't have to go over there and be like, hey, I would like to learn more about your community. But you could sit next to somebody new and in a circle. You could go to a food booth that you don't usually go to. Maybe go look for an event that you've never been to. Like, actually try to put it on your list where you are doing things where you will interact with different people. Because if you don't, and you just wait for them to magically appear, you're not doing the work, and you're almost doing a disservice to the work itself, because it's obviously not something that you're serious about. So that's what I'm with that.
Excellent. Absolutely. These are all great notes in terms of how we can actually, create lasting relationships. And that's the only way you're gonna be able to create change, if you listen and have those relationships with marginalized communities. Something that Dan Blaker just put in the chat was about the scarcity mindset. That's super prevalent at OCF. And that does, I think that plays into what you guys are saying in terms of, if we're afraid that we don't have passes or aren't going to get called back, or, don't have a position of power, then are we going to make a big stink about it in a room full of white folks? And that can be like a defense mechanism and a safety net, for BIPOC folks or queer folks, in terms of, you end up stepping on people in order to try to keep that safe space for yourself, or because there is that, scarcity mindset and not listening. So thanks for that, Dan. So one thing that we have touched on multiple times, actually, I feel like almost every consultant said this in a different point during some of the previous questions, is about safe spaces at FAIR. And this is a huge one. It's been a massive goal of the diversity committee for years, trying to create these different spaces. So the next question is around that. At OCF, we have a few spaces that are intended to be safer spaces, such as Whitebird, Info Booths, The Void, the Moon Lodge, and the Rainbow Village. We also have new spaces that are upcoming next year. We're super excited about the BIPOC Sanctuary and the Rainbow Connection. Unfortunately, many marginalized people don't feel safely held in these spaces due to a lack of training in DEI or just a lack of representation in those spaces. Like in Whitebird, they're awesome for crisis intervention, but are they fully aware maybe of some issues that might be facing marginalized communities, right? Do they create a welcoming space in all the ways they can? So this question is, how can OCF create an environment that is welcome to and safer for all, especially within these spaces that we're trying to create? What can you guys think that may create that environment that is welcoming, and or at least if it's not fully welcoming, you know, that feels safe enough for those members of marginalized communities.
As
One
the
up.
newbie, oops,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Mark.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Keep on
As the
first.
newbie.
I mean, as the newbie, I think representation matters. If I'm going to go to a BIPOC sanctuary, I would expect to see some Black, Indigenous, or people of color. I also think that it really does depend on what sort of you're seeking, because like I feel Whitebird is different than like, you know, the BIPOC sanctuary. It's like if I'm going to Whitebird, there's an issue, there's a problem, and I may only feel comfortable sharing that problem with a person, maybe like with a fellow woman or something like that. And if we really want to make it safe, it's all about having the individual who's reporting or talking about the issue feel safe. It's not about the actual comfortability of the people who are in the, I guess, the service, the people who are providing the service, if that makes sense. It's like, in order to get the safe space, the people that are coming to you have to feel heard. And I'm sure my other colleagues will be able to explain it a little more concrete than that.
With one of the organizations I work with, one of the things you have to understand, this is me basically saying, we lie to you. And here's how we lie to you, okay? You're used to a salt and pepper reality, and we're experiencing habanero. So we don't want to trigger the white woman in distress so that we're saving you when we're sharing our pain. We just want you to hear our pain, and if all that it takes is for you to take your foot off our neck to do that. Right? So that's not a chip on my shoulder, that's your knee on my neck, which definitely has resonance in these George Floyd times, right? But we lied to you about our pain. And so when you're experiencing this salt and pepper reality and we're experiencing habanero, we're going to ask for a Tabasco solution, which you then reject. So that's part of the issue about how honest can we be. Now, having had a long relationship with Whitebird and Cahoots, they're trying to address that, even though they know that most of their diversity is showing up in gender non-conforming people and a few people of color, and they recognize, okay, we're medical, we definitely need to address this within our work. And so engaging that, okay, I'm a medical professional, we can engage on that, and you can basically deal with the disparities that you're dealing with, and we'll slowly change. So they're willing to do that. So part of the piece then is understanding, will you kind of make that necessary change that's actually reasonable? Will you, that you reasonable person standard, is the reasonable person white, cisgendered, middle class person in power? Or is it a BIPOC person that's trying to get your knee off my neck? And should I ask nicely for you to do that? Maybe you were unaware that was happening. Not sure how you could be, but there are people that have that. And so being able to make those changes. So should there be an African village within the BIPOC space? Sure. But that means that in implementing that, you're going to have to open up the, open up the quote unquote jury for crafters or performers or things like that outside of the people that you know. Talking about the corporate OCF you, not you in particular.
Iana, you had asked the question about, and to go back to the question, it was something like, I don't even totally remember, but something about like making spaces feel safer or more inclusive, or things like Whitebird. I think things like the BIPOC Sanctuary and the Rainbow Connection are by design created for that purpose, as places where people can go when they don't feel connected. I mean, it's a place of celebration where you just want to go hang out with folks in your affinity group. And also it's a place when Whitebird does something discriminatory, you can go and like process it and get some advocacy. I mean, some of the recommendations that we've made have to do with having folks on site who are committed to DEI, so that there's a point of contact DEI kind of rescue team. So if you have a situation with somebody from security, and several of us here have, that feels really aggressive and or discriminatory, then you call in those folks to come mitigate the situation. There's a booth to go to if you just want to process, a care booth. More of like the not I have a boo-boo, but I have an emotional boo-boo and I need to go talk to somebody where I can show up and be supported. So those are in the recommendations, that we have that, and that will mitigate, because it will always happen. Things will always happen at Whitebird. Things will always happen at the info booth. We are swimming in it. And how do we mitigate those injuries as when they do happen at the point of contact? And maybe even someone can take on making it a learning moment for the person who's committed the injury, but the person who's been injured is being tended to in a way that actually feels congruent, where they aren't a victim who's having to recount and be retried in that moment. And so places like the Moon Lodge, I ran the Moon Lodge for 10 years, and that isn't a safe space. It's a safer space, but there's definitely homophobia, there's definitely transphobia, there's definitely TERFs who are trans exclusionary radical feminists who embody that space. So there's going to be stuff that comes up in the BIPOC sanctuary. That's a big umbrella. There's going to be stuff that comes up in the LGBTQIA+ space. That's a huge umbrella. And so, there's going to be stuff, and we're going to continually be working it out. Places can be safer and dedicated to these ideas. And it will be an ongoing process of ongoing honing of the detail and the nuance. And at least there'll be a next step of folks who are from a range of experience holding these injuries as they happen.
Absolutely. And sorry, I see you want to go, Asante, just along those lines, though, Oblio. So you were speaking on the recommendations, and I did read part of number 5 earlier, which is about having a dedicated space booth at the fair to address those grievances and violations. And I believe it's also number 17 and 19 in the recommendations. Once they're posted, y'all can check them out. But 17 is at the info booths, have a visual representation like pride flags or BLM images, disability images, so folks know that they can ask questions pertaining to that. So that creates a safer space at the info booth, as well as number 19 was to create a point of contact, like intervention staff for advocacy that's on call on site. And that would mean that when someone at fair is in an altercation, especially with fair staff, then an advocacy team can come and assess, support, and de-escalate the situation and determine further action. So a lot of these answers are in these recommendations, but I appreciate the further in depth. That's just for those of you that haven't checked out the recommendations yet. But yeah, so that's a great piece to put in there. And Johnny, did you have something to add to this one?
Be an advocate for yourself and for other people. I do some anti-bullying stuff with little guys, and they have to make 3 promises by the time we're done. And the first promise is, I will take responsibility for my own behavior. I will not try to be like everyone else. As simple as that is, that's powerful for a little kid. You don't have to be like everyone else. Be yourself. 2, if someone says something or does something that hurts someone else or makes them sad, I will speak up for them. How many people make that promise? All the little hands go up. If someone says something or does something that hurts your feelings or makes you sad, you speak up for yourself and go tell an adult. All the little hands go up. And so I asked the kids, I said, if everybody in this room speaks up for each other in this classroom, who's going to get bullied? Nobody. And so you think about, if everybody in the fair sees themselves as an advocate for each other, then that puts us all in position of working to address these issues. If you see it, you're obligated to say something. If you yourself in that space can't say something, go tell someone else. That this person needs some help. And I think that is what community will do in creating a safe space if we really do care about the fair being a safe space for everybody. That every one of us got a little sheriff badge to be an advocate for each other about creating and maintaining a safe space. And communicating that, I think that is just a baseline expectation that all of us are responsible for creating and maintaining this safe space for everybody.
Definitely. Safe space, safer spaces. For those of you that aren't checking out the chat, one definition, thank you Oblio and Mark for this, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs is a term that Oblio used. And then one thing that Mark just said, safer spaces should also engage in strengthening potential targets, contextualize the wounds as training scars. Nice little tidbits there. So if we're all done with this one, I feel like we worked the safer spaces unless anyone else has something they want to add. Siobhan?
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing really quick that I was listening to my colleagues say, it's like, Dr. Lake hits the nail on the head. I mean, if kids understand, if you see something, say something, it's like, we can all understand that. I think what happens as we get older is that we think, oh, somebody else will say something, or somebody else has seen it, or it's already known, so I don't want to speak up. And so I think really one way to make a safer space is to check in with your community. Is, if you see something and it looks wrong to you, say something. Don't think that, the person next to you is going to say something, even if it comes out, oh no, they, I don't know, juggle chainsaws every day. It's normal. But, you want to bring that up if it seems a little odd to you. And don't be afraid, because it's never going to be a bad thing for you to bring up somebody who could potentially be in harm.
Definitely. The risk of bringing it up is not as bad as the risk of it not being talked about. That's huge. Thank you. Yeah. Why is it the kids can get this stuff and none of us can, right? Or we can, but So the next piece, which we haven't touched on too much of this type of reality yet in terms of queer representation and such. The next question is, how has transphobia shown up at FAIR, and what can we do to be a safer space for the trans and non-binary community in particular? And I know that Oblio mentioned a couple things earlier around misgendering, or around, like what Siobhan was talking about with signage for bilingual stuff. A similar thing can happen, like as we know, in bathrooms and such. But it's definitely an issue that I feel like has not fully been tackled by the FAIR, at least in my opinion. So does anyone have any thoughts on how has transphobia shown up at FAIR, and what can we do to be a safer space for the trans and non-binary community in particular, to respect the gender spectrum?
I have a very rudimentary thing that I have been practicing. I haven't actually seen it at FAIR, so I don't know. But just in my general life moving forward, I now give my pronouns when I introduce myself. And that was something that I didn't really quite understand. So Oblio helped me out with that. Thank you. And now it's in my taglines, and I try to always make it more inclusive and hopefully welcoming for them to share their pronouns with me.
I really appreciate what Siobhan just said, because that is one of the simplest ways to show up in allyship, is just to share your name and pronouns. Because if we're not going to assume somebody's names, why would we assume a pronoun? And, share, and to make yourself vulnerable first, because it's vulnerable, especially if you're somebody who's newly out or just questioning. And certainly at the Rainbow Village, we see tons of youth and folks that come from all over the country to come to Country Fair. This may be the first time that somebody's actually able to express themselves and be. So if we say something like our name and pronoun, and like, wait a minute, I didn't have to be the one, and create that safe space, or wear pronoun pins or those kinds of things. We have parades and stuff that happens through Risk of Change. There's been a lot of queerness already happening at FAIR that's being celebrated. Risk of Change does trans parade, does a pride parade. Join those things, go be part of those things. Already, FAIR, one of the activism pieces I did at FAIR was to have signs put up at the urinals, because we have urinals that are stand to pees and squat to pees. And so I asked the FAIR, and the FAIR did it. So this is something the FAIR can applaud. We made little haikus and made little dog signs that said, you know, if you squat to pee, this is the place for you, gender inclusive. If you stand to pee, this is the place for you, gender inclusive. Because lots of people in lots of different ways sit or stand or squat. Now, I will tell you some of the discrimination I face, that even when those signs, when somebody who looks like me walks in the squat urinal, which people used to call the urinals, please don't call it that. When I go in there to squat to pee, sometimes women will get really testy with me. And so if you see that happen to someone like me, you say, do you squat to pee? Ask me. I'm like, yes. And then, you know, just be my ally in those places, because I still get bathroom discrimination when I walk into a squatnal, which I love those things. So especially if I have a skirt on, it makes it really nice and easy. So as Siobhan said, when you see something, say something. But not making those gendered assumptions. And you know, so another thing that's happened to me a bunch at FAIR, there's somebody in the community village who likes to talk all about how hormones being dumped into the water ocean through trans people is what's causing mutations in our ecology. And, you know, so, you know, waxing philosophical about why or how trans people exist, how they're destroying the environment through our choices, whether or not why we're making our choices, you know, those, so being mindful about the conversations that you engage in, and also not asking trans people questions that are invasive. If you wouldn't ask your cis friend about their genitals or what surgeries they have or who they're going to hook up with or how they hook up, don't ask your trans friends or somebody that you see as gender nonconforming. Don't ask those questions. So those, a lot of the times what we see in terms of the microaggressions are people trying to make connections, and they're like, oh, I see you're trans. So trans person, I'm going to ask you this really invasive question to try to connect. And so the intention is to try to connect, but the end result is some pretty big boundary crossing. So just be mindful of your questions and waxing philosophical about some people's actual existence.
I think and support an ongoing educational process, which ignorance is one major source of the phobia. So for those of us who are, let's see, xenophilic, we love aliens. We want to find out about them. So we don't want to ask difficult, unrespectful questions. We want to know what questions to ask when it becomes relevant. Because the default orientation of, well, these islands and also Turtle Island that you're on accepted multiple gender expressions before colonization. And so the reason I use not an English he, him pronoun, I use an indigenous one that basically says, I'm the other half of you, whether I sit or squat to pee, because I have done both, depending on what is the cultural context that I'm in. All right, so part of we're the same being. And so what I need to know is also what you need to feel stronger, and how do I participate in weakening you, because I don't want to do that.
Another thing I think it is important to share, because we are sitting on the unceded land of the Kawapūya people, is when you're thinking about trans people or even your own trans identity, because obviously trans people can be problematic in lots of different ways. And one of those ways I see happening, especially in hippie woo-woo culture, is to call yourself a two-spirit being. And you don't get to call yourself that unless you have indigenous roots. And not just potentially like somebody told you in your family one day that you might have it. You know, there's this way in which do your research and make sure you're showing up in a way that's integrous. Two-spirit is reserved for people who are indigenous. And And it doesn't matter if you really appreciate Indigenous culture. You can be a trans person, you can be a non-binary person. You don't get to be a two-spirit person.
That does get into the cultural appropriation piece.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I see something that just got popped into the chat. I'll read real quick, unless somebody else has something they're answering in this moment. It says, in an earlier session today, something came up about the performance of gender as part of the spectacle of the fair by people who are cis-identified playing with gender as part of a fair costume. And that becoming problematic for people whose presentation of gender doesn't match people's expectations, but isn't a performance. It's part of an identity. So how do you see these two ways of experiencing gender interacting? And can we have gender performance as part of our spectacle without harming trans folks?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cis people get to play with clothes. Clothes don't have a gender. So you can, if you follow Alok, I don't know how to pronounce their last name, but look up Alok degender fashion, because then you'll get schooled on all of the ways that clothes do not have a gender. So where it becomes problematic and appropriative and offensive is when somebody, and I'm going to be honest, a lot of times it's a cis dude wearing a skirt and they're acting as if they're a joke. So they're like, "Ooh, look at me," you know, and they're making it into some sort of comedy and some form of expression that isn't actually expressing a facet of self, but something to make fun of. And we see that quite frequently. So if you want to wear anything that actually feels like something that's expressing part of yourself, you can still be a cis person who's wearing something that hasn't been designated by societal norms to be for your sex assigned at birth or your gender identity. And if you're rocking it and you're feeling it, we're going to embrace you, because the more that we all play with those parts of ourselves in authentic ways, the more that we degender fashion and we can all show up in our authentic expression. So I honor cisgender people who want to wear clothes that don't necessarily, society doesn't affirm. I'll affirm you, but just don't make it a joke.
That's great. I love it. So I just popped that into the chat, the reference that Obio just put up. If you want to go check that out. Looks like their site is actually getting restructured, but that's amazing. Degendering fashion. We love that concept. All right. Are people feeling ready to move on to the next question, or do we have any more to say about this loveliness? Looks like we're moving on. All right. Our next question is, how can cultural appropriation at OCF be harmful to BIPOC in attendance? Oh, you're right, Obi. I may have mispronounced that. Alok.
Oh.
I don't.
Oh, no. You were great. I just didn't want to pronounce their last name because. Okay.
Yes, I don't know. I may have said it wrong as well, but
it happens to you all the time, I bet too. So we're trying.
I'm Iona, who knows?
Yep.
So I love that this cultural appropriation thing came up, because we were just talking about two-spiritedness, and a lot of people resonate with that, just like we resonate with, democracy being an Iroquois thing and all this. I mean, how much where's the appreciation versus the appropriation, right? With these issues. So I don't know if any of you are inspired to speak on how cultural appropriation can be harmful to the BIPOC people in attendance.
I just want to say one thing, and then I'll shush and let this one be taken by other folks. But it dovetails on what we were just talking about, particularly in terms of queer culture, and specifically queer BIPOC culture, and specifically T BIPOC culture. There's a way in which, there's a thing called ballroom culture, and it's where BIPOC folks who were queer and trans were able to find solace in one another, to create networks of safety for one another, to be able to make fun of and mock access that they didn't have to things, and to develop art. So all of these things, it's many, many things. And that's coming out in mainstream culture now. You can see it in Pose, a show called Pose. You can see it in a show called Legendary. And a lot of people in dominant cultures are getting a window into that in a way that they haven't seen. I invite you to watch Paris is Burning to get a real context. And that's great that these folks are being honored for all of their resilience. And then at FAIR, I see people saying, oh, tens across the board. You know, people are taking words and concepts from culture and bringing it forward as if it were their own. And so that's a place where I see T-BIPOC and QT-BIPOC culture being appropriated. And it's one thing to appreciate. It's one thing to give your money, give your time. I want to see ballroom artists being featured on the main stage at FAIR. I don't see any of that. I've never seen any ballroom people being featured at FAIR, although a bunch of us do it in the background, you know, but when you do that, you view it with reverence. You don't get to claim the buzzwords. You don't get to claim the space. You take your step back and watch it. So that's, and pay your reverence. So that's just one thing that I see and have seen at FAIR specifically. And just an example of QT BIPOC culture being appropriated.
That's a great different aspect to cultural appropriation. Thank you. Siobhan, did you have something to speak on?
Yeah, just kind of to piggyback off of what Oblio just said, it's like, I think the reverence is the important part, the honoring of the culture. Also, to see if there is somebody from the culture that can perform the performance that you are looking to exhibit. That's also a really important factor. That like for me, I think that there is a lot of, I like Oblio was saying, like the quotes or taking the catchphrases and not getting it. And I think that, you know, I mean, everybody wants to be cool, but you have to understand that you are literally ripping someone's skin off of them and trying to put it on when you're doing that without having some sort of, at the most basic, an understanding of where it comes from, and then celebrating it, trying to bring it to more people, bringing the knowledge to different groups. It's like, I like to make beaded bracelets. And it's something that I've done my whole life. And my grandma taught me how to do it. And I know that there are a lot of Native Americans and other cultures who make beaded bracelets, but you can also go over to Sally's and pick up a beaded bracelet and you can have the same sort of idea. But if you don't know where that comes from, you don't have that history, you don't have that reverence, it seems like it's a really bad way to show that you're trying to participate. It's like, yes, let me play with you, but I'm going to take all your toys. And I think with wanting to be inclusive and really understanding, because it is interesting and it's a special part of people's cultures. Otherwise, it wouldn't have spread so rapidly. It wouldn't become a catchphrase. I think that's the most important part, is you just have to have reverence and appreciate it. And also, if there is somebody of that culture, like if you have Native Americans on the tribal lands that we currently occupy, it might be good for them to do their own ceremonial dance as opposed to having people who maybe aren't Native Americans. And again, I haven't really been to FAIR, so I'm just throwing an example out there.
And culture is the bigger part of any human being's identity. It gets submerged sometimes underneath our perceptions or conceptions about race. But the surface culture is what most people tend to engage, which is the visible culture. And they call that cultural engagement. That is really not cultural engagement until you get to the 90% of culture that's actually invisible to the human eye. And you don't get there by choice. You have to be invited. You have to be welcome. You have to be someone that people trust. I'm not going to take you to my grandma's house unless I know you're a good person. You know, so you're not going to get to my deeper culture just because you want to. And so you have to be respectful of what it means for someone to invite you into their deeper cultural representations and not practice the surface culture stuff and say, oh, I had a great time. I went to Cinco de Mayo. I had fun. You know, I was speaking Spanish with everybody and I bought some stuff, or going to the powwow. People think going to the powwow is really going deep into Native American identity and culture. All of those are what our society has gotten practice at. we're called cultural tourists in many parts of the world. We love to go places, we like to dance, we like to eat their food, we want to hang out with them for a while, but then we never want to stay. So if you're not operating like a tourist, you're operating like a resident. And does a resident care about the safety of the people? Does a resident care about the quality of the food that the people have to eat? Or the water that they have to drink? Or the health of the people? So when you enter into another person's culture, operate like you live there, that you do care about their children. You do care about their elders, instead of as a tourist who's just there for a moment and then you're going to run back to wherever you came from.
Absolutely. That is huge.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to honor y'all's time because we did say we would be finishing at 6:30. We got through almost all the questions, only 2 left. So I don't know if, depending on your time commitments, if there are any questions or anybody wants to bring anything else up, since I was the one asking the questions the whole time almost. Although thank you, Sam, and I believe Dan, who is gone, but they did contribute a little bit. If it's fine with the panelists, I'll open it up for just a second to see if anyone has something that they want to speak on or share. And otherwise, I would just offer last words and closing remarks for you all so that we don't keep you too far past the time commitment that we already asked of you.
Part of the elements of culture. Culture could be described as a collection of survival memes and technologies that basically were evolved in a culturally specific context to meet a survival need. And because of that, as Johnny pointed out, especially when I'm sitting here on Hawaii, lots of tourists come here even without any awareness that there's been genocide here. That's still ongoing and fresh. So it becomes America's playground where tourists come and they bring their bubble and they leave, and then don't necessarily just see the surface of aloha without understanding the spirit of it, as a cultural insider does or would. And so when it's easy, for example, one of the classic ways this comes up with FAIR is the use of Tlingit Haida imagery in, for example, the sauna, right? And we've appropriated the term low person on the totem pole without understanding, as cultural insiders, that the person that's on the bottom is the strongest person holding everybody else up, not the least powerful person in a hierarchy, right? So in terms of understanding, what monkey see, monkey do. People will copy and imitate hot ideas that are on the surface without getting into the actual spirit that generated them, or even understand the history that generated them. And so being old enough to remember when the LGBT was Two-Spirit, and basically coming from indigenous people saying, listen, we had and incorporated gender diversity as an integral part of our society, and that's, to quote Bell Hooks, if I may, sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize your power, not because they don't see it, but because they see it and they don't want it to exist. So they actively try to destroy you because of your power and magic. And so part of that reverence is understanding that you may appropriate something without understanding and preserving the cultural needs that appropriation, the thing appropriated, represents. So try to understand things from a cultural insider's point of view.
Beautiful. Do any other wonderful panelists have last comments or closing remarks? You don't have to if you don't want to.
I would just say this is a long road. To be patient with yourself as well as with other people. Sometimes we'll extend more patience to other people than we ever are willing to extend to ourselves. And be humble in this work. All of us, be humble in this work. We are taking on a system, not just an individual. I wish it was Bull Connor or George Wallace. We could probably jack him up and take care of whatever the problem was. But we are challenging a system. And so we need to make sure we stay healthy as well as help each other to stay healthy. So thank you all.
Absolutely, that's good.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, to follow Dr. Lake, sorry.
No, I just appreciate everybody. Go ahead.
I was just, it really is, you have to be patient with yourself. I think that's kind of the best way to practice self-care is to be forgiving. We did not create this mess. I hate to say it, but we are not going to solve this mess. All we can do is make it better, and understanding that and celebrating each little inch or centimeter or mile forward, however you measure, I think is very important. And also this right here, this transparency, having these open conversations, posting the recommendations for everybody to see. I think that it just in itself is being more inclusive as well. So I applaud OCF for doing that. That's a good, you can put that on one of the goals board. It's like, yay, we're working towards transparency. So I'm very thankful that we were able to come and speak to you guys a little bit further.
And I'm going to eat. My food's been sitting here looking at me for the last 30, 40 minutes. So you guys know I must like you because I've been snipping little bites, but I'm going.
Self-care. You need to. We appreciate you, Johnny.
Yeah. Thank you all. Good to see everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up.
Stay strong.
Yes, thank you all so much for being here today, for all the work you've done up until this point, both as pay consultants and many of you volunteering for years, decades, collectively, certainly decades, your whole life in some instances. It's super important work. I mean, it's really, rewarding and exhausting, and your insights are really powerful. This has been kind of a really powerful capstone to a series of talks that have gone on all day. So I really appreciate you making the time to be part of this virtual event. And it's nice to see your faces all together.
Bye, friends.
Bye.
Thank you for hosting this, Iana, Brooks, and Britannia. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
You
Happy
are.
to help facilitate.